All right, so we're talking about sins of the security state. Also going to be talking about the left, security state, corporate America, and Wall Street. Now, you titled it "Sins of the Security State." Why did you go with that title?
Because at this point, I firmly believe that what the left predominantly is, the dreadful left, is the security state, corporate America, and Wall Street, and special interests of those groups. And I think that they're symptoms of the left, which are progressive movements meant mostly to distract us. There are, and a lot of those individuals may be sincere, but they do get funding, and they are logically inconsistent. And they also abuse statistics quite often. Pew Research does. Anyway, the left, which again I firmly believe is the security state, Wall Street, and corporate America. They have their chosen politicians, their chosen media outlets. It's pretty well established now that the New York Times and CNN are agents of the security state, and they never really push back on the misinformation from the security state, and they don't follow mergers or antitrust stories whatsoever. And so yeah, that's why I wrote this, because I think that anyone who's anti-left and focuses on fringe movements like feminism, I think that these people are incompetent. I don't think that they're actually producing any results whatsoever. Following Democratic politicians and their progressive policies, and even Republican politicians, which I'm going to get into, that they're both the issue here, is it doesn't produce any results. Most of our anti-left speakers on YouTube, like Ben Shapiro, they're completely inept at solving this problem. They produce no results. They don't know what the left is, and they're constantly failing.
Well, this is a quick side, maybe a tangent. So when you say, of course, you're talking about the left here, and you're what you consider the left and what Ben Shapiro would consider the left, or what Fox News would consider the left, right, are two, almost seems like two totally different things, or like they only focus on one small aspect of what the left is. So maybe give us a breakdown of what you would consider where they come up short into what their definition of the left is, or what is included in the left.
They focus on symptoms of the left. So they rarely focus on things that are simply not the left. They are symptoms of the left. You know, like the feminist movement back in like 2010, or not 2010, but around 2012, it received massive funding despite being internally inconsistent. And a lot of progressive movements out of universities, they also receive massive funding. Even Antifa received massive funding, and Antifa is simply an anarchist organization. I've been on their forums on the darknet, and I've read their articles. They are simply an anarchist group. They literally believe that all governments are fascist, and so you can't really use them. If you were a neoliberal now, a lot of neoliberals were doing was they were using Antifa as an argument that our current system is fascist, because why else would we have anti-fascists among us? It's a silly argument. Both sides make silly arguments like this. I guess you'd call them false comparisons. And well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that they were simply they simply believe that all governments are fascists. And then you got your BLM, and obviously it's pretty well established now that they're a communist organization for the most part. And Antifa and BLM, by the way, they're allies for the moment. They're not necessarily. We don't really know if their union is going to last. Antifa's articles that I found on their darknet forums, they did actually specifically mention BLM in some of these articles, stating that BLM and Antifa are different, but at the moment their interests align. And so they said in their articles, go to BLM rallies and have a presence there, so let people know that Antifa was there, but don't hinder BLM's rallies or BLM activists. And then, I mean, we could talk about the symptoms of the left all day. We can talk about progressive policies and the undertone of like the Marxist sort of push in our country and in universities, in our media. But at the end of the day, if you look at who's funding these things, why they exist, like, what is the purpose of an organization like BLM? What's the purpose of an organization that abuses crime statistics? That if any statistician, anyone trained at statistics, were to sit across from a BLM activist, they'd mop the floor with them. So what is the point? Why would an organization like that be so successful? And you know, most of the people that you talk to now, they're anti-BLM. It's really interesting thing happened in around 2012 when the feminist movement began. Something very, very interesting happened. Everyone thought that this wave of feminism was just incredibly powerful. Everyone thought that, like, they're everywhere, right? And it literally took 2 years before people started to finally put the picture together that the internet and media, side note, like social media, created echo chambers. And so all these extremists would go to these echo chambers, you know, and there's a selection bias. And so happens to be places, these nodes, where a lot of other people, normal people, go and interact with each other. But all of these extremists were converging on these nodes. And so there's a selection bias that looked like they were much bigger than they actually were. And it literally took 2 years for people to realize that they're not actually the majority. There was literally a time where people thought that the feminist movement was the majority, and it never was. It never even came close. It was a bunch of extremists, and they were very influential, and they were funded. And not only were they funded, but studies which were very unscientific were funded, in which case they abused this statistical method. All of this is symptoms of the left. You have to wonder, why would an organization like BLM pop up? Because it opposed the current regime. And the left, that was in the left's interests.
Okay, and then as mentioned, a symptom like feminism, now for the feminist movement, is fairly non-existent because it served its purpose for the left. They started, it was around a couple of years, and then once that movement no longer held traction or was enough of a hammer to attack their opposition, it was discarded and replaced, which seems to be a continuing pattern for the left.
It never was discarded, though. It never was discarded, because now we have BLM, and they have some notable features between the two of them. They're both based on victimhood. And so for Marxism to take hold of a country, to take hold of any system, you have to have some sort of handle for it. You can't just simply introduce it all willy-nilly. For you to introduce it, you need some sort of handle. You need to be able to state that this system is abusive towards certain people. There's a power dynamic, and it's very unfair, and this new system will help that. And so, if you were a Marxist, do you really care at the end of the day? I mean, if you really want Marxism, do you really care if there are such groups? If there really is a group that you can find that's victimized by the rest? And no, you don't. You just care that you can convince people of it. So it's actually pretty easy to prove that the arguments that feminism and BLM relies on are nonsense. They're not actually groups that are meaningfully victimized, not in our society. But there were handles for Marxism to take hold. And for factions of the left that are not Marxist, because the left is not simply Marxism. That's not the case. I don't see how it would really benefit the security state to have Marxism, unless, of course, it helps with their spying campaigns, because it has been shown. I'll have to provide some links in the description, that the more socialist or the more communist that society is, the more internal surveillance, the less rights the individuals have and that would benefit an entity that was obsessed with gaining intelligence and surveillance on its own people, which the security state is very much obsessed with. And so what I was saying is, even though most of the left probably isn't Marxist, they use the Marxist movement to oppose the current regime, very much in the same way that Antifa and BLM, the organizations, were aligned for the election cycle for the past, year and a half. And a lot of these organizations like BLM and Antifa and feminism and the trans movement, they do have sincere members within them, severely disenfranchised people who happen to be very entitled and happen to believe that if they place themselves in a group that they believe is victimized, whether it is or not, then they'll gain some sort of cheap social status from that. Those people, they're not important. Societies have always had people like that. We're always going to have people who are disenfranchised who are looking for a free handout, and they'll do so by whatever means they can find by placing themselves in a victimized group. These are symptoms of a problem. Those sincere people, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily part of the left. They are used by the left, though. They're I guess you could call them useful idiots.
So they're being used by the left and obviously the security state as a way to divert attention away from what is really going on, or the bigger issues that are being used in order to accomplish their goals. So they're just kind of paraded around in front of us in order so we don't see them. Let's talk about some of those security state sins. So we have a couple here. Let's jump into the one you want to talk about. Maybe the first one, I'll just look at it. So the NSA obtained authorization to indiscriminately obtain communication records from Verizon users. Yes. Now, they're part of the security state. Obviously, the NSA is. What's the problem with the NSA or a government organization doing this? Because they're doing it to protect us. At least that would be their claim.
That was back in 2013, and they obtained the authorization. They obtained it for a period of time, for like 6 months or so, and it's not clear that they ever actually stopped performing that data collection. So the NSA is a part of the security state arm that is obsessed with obtaining data. Now, an organization like the FBI might use that, obtain authorization to use that data, but the NSA obtains it. And as to why they are so obsessed with obtaining data, I don't know. That's anyone's guess. Most of us, if we were to guess on that, we're in conspiracy theory land. But they would argue that it's for national security. They always argue that it's for national security. Entities like the NSA argue that 9/11 never would have happened if we had had boots on the ground and surveillance happening in Islamic states. In January of 2018, Justin Amash rallied House Republicans to safeguard Americans from internal surveillance. It was kind of an interesting article because the NSA is the entity that does the surveillance, and then the FBI is the entity that uses that surveillance for its investigations. And that surveillance is unconstitutionally imposed on us. And so it was one of the interesting things about this situation was that he didn't have a whole lot of success with House Democrats. A lot of the same Democrats that criticized Trump for being a fascist dictator approved of his surveillance gaining NSA and FBI. So there's a bit of cognitive dissonance there. So ultimately, he didn't gain enough of the majority to actually do anything with that.
Yeah. And it is interesting because in 2018 we were still hearing. So obviously, this is another thing that we never hear about, which is important to point out, is that stories like this, you don't hear about them because there's always something popular going on in the news. Because I believe in 2018 it was the back end of the Russian investigation, quote unquote, and Trump supposedly receiving aid and help from Russia during the election, and that was being parroted and trumpeted for close to 2 years. We had the the Mueller investigations.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that things like this never actually get brought to light on a grand scale. Even though you might catch them on a news site here or there, but they never get reported on. You always hear Trump this, Trump that, president this, president that.
Well, the left, I hate to use that colloquial term,
Yeah.
Because so many ineffective YouTubers use it.
Mm-hmm.
But the left sincerely believes that if the American people knew about that story while it was happening, there may have been a different outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So they clearly are afraid of how Americans would view internal surveillance and the lack of transparency of the security state. And anytime something is introduced to with the effect of making the security state more transparent, there's always something else to get the peasants rolling, I suppose, so that they'd have their attention focused elsewhere. September of 2018, around the same time frame, Miles Taylor, he was the former chief of staff to President Trump's Department of Homeland Security, and so he was the first person within Trump's cabinet to denounce him while serving under him. And shortly after that, he's a security state official, and shortly after that, he was hired by CNN. And this is a story that's been replicated many times over the past 12 years of security state officials going to CNN or especially the New York Times. There's a huge agglomeration of past security state officials working for their chosen media outlets.
It is interesting that it's supposed to be like the guy should be at the top of the conservative pile, or at the top of the Republican pile. He's working for Trump. He's his chief of staff, and then all of a sudden he denounces him and goes to CNN, which is, like we said, we hate to use the term, but a left-wing news organization that has multiple people doing this exact same thing coming to them after their supposed conservative tenure.
And by left wing, I don't think this can be stated enough times. By left wing, what we really mean, if we were very clever and we were to observe the patterns of the left, what we really mean by left wing when we use that term on media outlets is that they don't go after corporate America. At the least, they don't go after corporate American mergers. They do nothing to protect us from future monopolists forming. They don't go after Wall Street. They don't go after misinformation of the security state. And in fact, they actively push the misinformation of the security state, which we'll get into in this video, actually. And I don't know if you remember, but when the Trump administration first came into office, General Michael Flynn came under fire in the FBI. So he, for his position, he made a customary call to a Russian ambassador. And there's nothing suspicious about it. It was just a customary call for his position. But so really, the reason that this is a story is because the FBI investigated him over that call, over frivolous claims that there was some sort of, that he overstepped himself. And he didn't. He was simply doing his job. Nothing came of that whatsoever. The CNN and New York Times really pushed that story that Trump was colluding with Russia because of this, but there was never any evidence actually produced for it. And so this is just another ploy by leftist media to push security state misinformation.
So it doesn't matter if it's true or not, if there's any claim to it. Like we mentioned in our last video, is that the algorithm and society in general, they see headlines. Right, they don't spend a whole lot of time looking at substance, so they see headline after headline after headline. Collusion here, Russian this, Trump that.
They know this works on individuals. They know that individuals form their opinions by internet searches and the headlines that show up in those searches. And another interesting point about that story is that his call wasn't just a customary call. It was he was trying to make amends because one of the Obama administration's parting gifts to Russia was a series of diplomatic sanctions, which would not bode well for the new administration coming in. And so he's basically calling this Russian ambassador to tell them that, hey, the sanctions are probably about to be lifted. It's a new administration. Don't retaliate against us. Let's keep communication lines open. Whether you're enemies or allies with a state, having communication lines open is probably a good thing.
And then, of course, it gets parroted. And we mentioned echo chambers earlier.
Yes.
This thing, the narrative gets pushed regardless of any factual information, and then it gets bounced around in echo chambers, and this person says, and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and people usually don't take the time to go back and look at the source, look at the root of what is actually being said. That Flynn called Russia, and obviously Russia and Trump are together in bed. Oh, because I saw this article, and then it just gets bounced around in a cave.
The content of the articles they take a cursory view or none at all whatsoever. People are quite literally forming their opinions over headlines right now. They have been for a while. And so if you had, we mentioned corporate America, there's a reason that we mention it. I mean, Google, for instance, is an extremely powerful entity right now. And they have algorithms by the way, that bleed over into like DuckDuckGo and stuff. And so when you type in something, whether it's true or false, you're going to get a lot of headlines. And you may have to scroll to the third page or the second page, or at least the bottom of the first page, to get an article that actually has substance in it. But people don't form their opinions, from hard labor. The summer of 2020, it was the second time that the Trump administration introduced a fund package, I guess you'd call it, to withdraw troops, because that just actually does cost money. And so it goes to the House Committee for a vote. And conveniently, just before the vote, the New York Times parroted the baseless claim the Taliban was that Russia was paying the Taliban to kill U.S. troops. And it was such a convenient article and it was such an opportune time that the House Committee ended up voting on blocking those funds. So this resulted in the continuation of a very long war. And their sources were, like always, anonymous officials from the security state making very vague claims, or in this particular case, it was the other way around. It was specific officials making very vague claims, which is always the case with them. It makes it more difficult to check their sources for credibility.
Now, do you think this article by the New York Times actually was written and had an effect on the ruling, or do you think the New York Times wrote this because they were kind of already aware of what the outcome was going to be, so they would seem more credible? Or was it maybe both?
That's a good question. Well, if you watch the vote, they do mention the article a lot. Mostly Democratic officials, Democratic House representatives were mentioning it, but some Republicans too. I don't remember the names. You have to go back and watch it, but they did mention the articles many, many times. So it had the desired effect.
It seems peculiar that a newspaper would be mentioned in a ruling that's that important instead of actual internal sources or military generals or experts weighing in, but instead they're citing a newspaper.
To this day, there's still no evidence of that claim. But there's no new House Committee vote. Now the Biden administration would have to introduce a troop withdrawal plan, and I'm sure the very same thing would happen.
All right, so we're going to look at, it's interesting, so talk about Russia. It is interesting, though, October 2020, Adam Schiff, chairman of House Intelligence Committee, makes an appearance on CNN, of course he does, to push the narrative that Hunter Biden emails were Russian disinformation. Now, isn't it weird that CNN is now talking about somebody who's on the left, and as we use the term, and they're trying to say, oh, no, there's no connection with Russia, even though there seems like there's an actual direct connection this time with Russia, as back in the day, if Trump had been found with a connection of this magnitude, it would have exploded, it would have been in the news, it would have been all over, you would have sent impeachment and people talking about it. But here we have a direct connection with Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and here now CNN comes to his defense. It is interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, also you don't forget that they listed 50 U.S. intelligence officials that had signed on to a letter basically stating that these emails had the classic earmarks of Russian disinformation. Earmarks, by the way, they have never been proven. Still, to this day, there's no proof of this. And I'm not spouting out nonsense when I say over and over again that leftist media push disinformation from the security state. they're not agents of information, and I know that Glenn Greenwald actually writes about they have committees basically for their fact checkers, and I mean they're not really fact checkers; they're agents of disinformation. But yeah, this is if real intelligence officials did sign onto that document, which they did, then you have a much bigger story here than just a news organization pushing a claim that has no evidence for it. You have intelligence officials pushing a claim that have no evidence for it. This is just one more story to pile on to all the others of the security state pushing misinformation. They didn't like the current regime for whatever reason. They wanted to overthrow it, and if the cost of doing that was misleading the public, then they're obviously very willing to do that.
Yeah, and it does seem odd that senior intelligence officials would sign on to a document claiming that somebody who is not running for president but is the son of a presidential candidate is willing to sign off on this. But nowhere during the Trump Russian investigations during that whole 2-year cycle did we ever see an intelligence group of this magnitude defending the sitting president of the United States.
No, we didn't. And the classic liberal ideals that journalists are supposed to operate on, you're supposed to question things, even if it may sound ridiculous to you or not. You're supposed to follow a story to its conclusion, and you're supposed to obtain as much evidence for whatever that conclusion is as possible. And it would seem that most leftist media outlets and journalists, if you could call them journalists, they didn't want to pursue the story. They didn't want to ask the question, is this real? If we followed this, what would we find? They didn't want to. Their knee-jerk response to this story was it's Russian disinformation, and it must come from the current administration. So in conclusion, on the first facet of Sins of the Left, which deals with the security state, we have this agglomeration of entities, of federal entities that have very little oversight. We have no access to information on their funds or their methodology, and they seem to be able to survey us at will. The Patriot Act is still going strong. Yeah, I consider it an enormous failure of the Trump administration to not do anything about that. The Verizon deal, it appears to still be going. I don't know if it is or not. One of the problems with the security state is that since there is no transparency, there's so very little stories on them, and they obviously have control of certain media outlets, so they can push stories and they can subvert stories. And if someone were watching this and they'd say, okay, then I believe you, so what do we do? Well, you have to demand transparency of the security state, and you have to demand accountability from them. I mean, we live in a democratic republic, so if you get enough people involved in this, enough people with their eyes open that are tired of sitting in these echo chambers where they're venting about symptoms of the left, like Ben Shapiro, if you get enough people who are tired of that and tired of the lack of progress that it produces, then you would probably have real issues being solved. The security state needs to be more transparent, and officials in the security state need to be held. The next facet of the article, Sins of the Left, is corporate America and Wall Street. And the most interesting thing about this is, well, first of all, it's not interesting. It's dull and boring. It's simply a list of mergers. After the aftermath of it is very interesting because these are incredibly expensive mergers that happened at opportune times where people were distracted by something else. And these mergers, by the way, another enormous failure of the Trump administration and Obama administration and Bush administration. The antitrust authorities have been asleep for a dozen years now. They haven't really been doing anything. We have more monopolists now than we've ever had. We've had more corporate lobbyists and corporate funded politicians now than we've ever had because corporations have never been this powerful. Their power has been completely unchecked. And this second facet of the article that I wrote is a compilation of mergers that most people have never heard of. You're talking like tens of billions of dollars worth of mergers. I mean, if you added them all together, the last half of 2020 had hundreds of billions of dollars worth of mergers, and most of these mergers people have never heard anything about.
Yeah. Now, before we jump in, let's look at antitrust. So you mentioned antitrust,
Yes.
which is something that never gets mentioned in popular news. Most people don't know what antitrust is. What is, the government's role in that? So maybe talk about antitrust, the antitrust arm in America, and what their job is in terms of their connection with mergers.
Antitrust legislation is meant to combat monopolists and unfair business practices. And the antitrust authorities are supposed to enforce that legislation. So we have the Federal Trade Commission, and it's 5 officials. They're elected for 7 years. You can have at most 3 officials from one party. So you can have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, or 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And for those people that think that the left is simply Democrats, or that think that even Democrats simply think that it's Republican versus Democrat, this is silly, bipartisan nonsense, and you're just a peasant at that point playing their game, because the Federal Trade Commission is headed by a Republican, and for many years now it's been 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And I know of a lot of conservatives, a lot of people who vote Republican, and they think that it's Republicans versus corporate America. They think it's Republicans versus the security state, Republicans versus the Democrats. They think that it's Republicans versus the corrupt Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the biggest misconceptions that I keep encountering. The Federal Trade Commission, which is something that all Americans should have been keeping their eye on for the past dozen years. And it's not just the administrations that failed us, it's us. We failed ourselves. We haven't been paying attention to it. Mergers go through every month. Every single month it's a new merger, and they go through unchecked. I assume that these officials on the Federal Trade Commission are getting money in their pocket, or they're getting funding. I'm not really sure why. I'm not sure if it matters. The only thing that really matters is that they're not doing their jobs. And right now they have a Republican majority. If you were a Democrat and you're watching this, you're like, see, you elbow bump your friends, you see it is Democrats versus Republicans. See, the Republicans, they're awful. They just want to take money away from the poor. It's clearly nonsense. Just that the first segment of this article, it had much more Democratic support than Republican for surveillance and for the ongoing war, and for censorship, corporate censorship, which, by the way, you can only really have with monopolists. So it's very easy to argue from either side that the Republicans are at fault, that the Democrats are at fault. We can play this game. It's a mindless game. It's simply not the case.
So why do we want government intervention like this? Because we're talking obviously about the left, security state, Wall Street, and government overreach into our lives. But then here we are talking about we want the government to step in and put its foot in the corporate world, in the our capitalistic world, and to stop mergers that may be too powerful. So some people might argue, oh, well, you don't want the government to step into our lives, but then here you are arguing, oh, we want the government to step in and to mess with companies. So is that what we're saying? We just want them to get in there. We want our cake and eat it too.
Right. Well, this is my argument. I'm sort of, I guess you could call me a classic liberal. Happens to be on the conservative end of the spectrum for the most part. But a lot of us believe in freedom of speech and just freedom in general. And so some people may argue, well, libertarian is what I'm more in. Most libertarians would argue that this corporation, well, they gain this status. Anyone could really gain this status, so why should we interfere with them? Any libertarian would be opposed to that. But here's my argument. Google came about in an era that had antitrust enforcement. They benefited from a system where antitrust enforcers stopped their competitors from being too powerful. If that were not the case when Google was forming, then they may never well have actually succeeded. And so you don't get to exist in this environment where you benefit from some rule or some system. And then when you become powerful enough where you can manipulate that system, you don't allow other people to use it. So that's my argument to my fellow libertarians, that you don't get to benefit from a system and then reach enough power to where other people can no longer benefit from it, which is exactly what is happening now. And so it's not actually fair play. It's not. And a lot of the mergers, they're not. If a company became a monopolist within its space by never acquiring another company, then, well, we're in a difficult position here. Like, are we infringing on the rights of these owners of this company? They simply had a great business model. They didn't buy up their competition. That's a much more difficult space to be in. However, we're mostly talking about mergers here, and it's quite a different matter when you have a company that's become powerful enough that it can acquire its competition, and not just acquire its competition, but a lot of these mergers they're corporations or companies that are buying other companies that are upstream or downstream of them. So, like, my example would have been like, you have Walmart and Ingalls, and they're in competition with each other within their space, and they both have truck companies that supply them. Maybe the same companies do, Well, what if Walmart said, well, we could lower our costs there if we bought a truck company, if we had our own line of trucks, and say Ingalls doesn't have that? Like, are they really fair competitors at this point? Walmart could do that. They could buy downstream of them too. And so it's called concentration creep, by the way. And so a lot of these mergers, they're not simply a company buying its competition, although a lot of them are. A lot of it's a company buying companies upstream and downstream of them.
So they're cutting off any means for another company to even jump into the space to be able to compete.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
so that'd be different. So you mentioned the company, we're talking about your libertarian friends. It'd be different if we saw a company that had a monopoly, but it became a monopoly because it simply provided the best product and nobody else could compete, not because they're being bought out because something unfair is happening, but because their product is so superior that it's the best one in the market and everybody goes to them. That'd be different than what we're talking about, where somebody is merging and forcibly pushing out any competition from even stepping into the space in the first place.
Well, one of the reasons you would ever be a capitalist is because you believe in competition, you believe in fairness to some extent. And I mentioned in our last video, which was supposed to precede that video, but it didn't. And in that video, I mentioned that with the vaccine distribution, states where there's more independent pharmaceutical companies, they were able to distribute the vaccine more effectively than states where there was more chains. So anywhere there was more competition, they did better at distributing it to the public than places where there was less competition and more chains.
It seems to always be the case that you get a better product when there's competition in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
Because there's always people trying to fight to create something better, versus if you have a monopoly, there's not innovation because it's not necessary.
Well, you don't just get better products, you also get better customer service. A chain doesn't have to compete within itself, so they don't have to offer better customer service. Matt Stoller wrote in one of his recent articles that these independent pharmaceutical companies, on average, they spent a lot more time with their clients than the chains. But we're digressing.
Yes.
One of the things I wanted to mention before I really went into mergers is that there's a difference between being an informed person and being an entertained person. And I have no better way to introduce this information than to read it off as the list that I wrote it. And it's not particularly interesting, but I do want to put my money where my mouth is and actually list some of these mergers. And I haven't written on this in the past 6 weeks, so any mergers that have happened in the past 6 weeks, I haven't written about. So let's get into this. November 30th, 2020, two of the largest providers of data to Wall Street, S&P Global and IHS Markit, merged for $44 billion. That's an enormous sum of acquisition. And I mean, I can't see how anyone could possibly argue that this is going to benefit people, or this is going to benefit the nation overall. Another one, Salesforce Incorporated, is an American cloud-based software company headquartered in San Francisco, California. Now, it acquired chat software producer Slack for $27 billion. That's another enormous sum, and no one heard of this. You know, people, mainstream outlets, some of them actually report on this, but not to the general public. From the New York Times, the acquisition will end Slack's brief run as an independent, publicly traded company. And get this, in 2019, Salesforce acquired Tableau, Bonobo AI, Map Anything, Gridable, Rebel, MuleSoft, Cloud Craze, and Datorama. All of those within 1 year. They're essentially a monopolist now. Adobe said it will acquire Workfront for $1.5 billion to add to a collaboration tool to its marketing software. There's actually quite a bit more mergers than this. There's a whole lot, but the point is that anyone watching this, there's a very small probability that they were informed on these matters. There was another merger of a street sweeper. I don't remember the sum, but it was enormous. And so I can see why someone would say, well, why is that important? Why would we care about street sweepers? Doesn't the state or like the county pay them to keep eyes off the roads? And like, yeah, that's true. They do pay them from tax money. And the East Coast essentially has but due to these mergers from this, not the East Coast, the Midwest, and part of the East Coast, due to the mergers of this street sweeper, they're a monopolist within our space. And if you were a county or a state official and you were looking for competition within this space, you'd have to go 500 miles. So now they can set the price artificially high, and the taxpayer has to pay for that because of a monopolist, because of a merger that should never have gone through. Anyone that was on the FTC should have seen that merger and come up with the very same arguments that I just came up with and said, no, we're not going to approve of this, or at the very least we're going to talk about it. And they didn't. They just went through without any sort of opposition. So Matt Stoller, I think I should mention him.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's only right.
Yeah.
Now I get if someone wanted to be informed, before I really go into Matt Stoller or Glenn Greenwald, you should go to the primary source of anything. Mm-hmm. You should never trust a journalist. Yeah. You should never trust any news without going to the primary source, reading it yourself. You'd be astounded by what you might learn from that method. Yeah. But I mostly use Bloomberg and New York Times, so we bash on the New York Times. But the fact of the matter is, when a big merger happens or a security state official makes a statement, it goes to the New York Times first, and they're the primary source. I don't know why that is, maybe because they're so established, but they still are an excellent source of merger news, and so is Bloomberg. One of the really interesting things that I've done lately is I've acquired, and I have an online brokerage account now, so I'm doing a little bit of trading, but mostly what you can do is it's a great source of news on all of this. Mm-hmm. They're not gonna, these are businessmen. They want news as fast as possible. And if New York Times is the primary source for some story, that's gonna be the story that shows up in your news feed on your online brokerage account. Mm-hmm. So you can get the primary source on a lot of these things if you have a brokerage account like Webull or something. Yeah. Now, Matt Stoller writes about mergers and antitrust stories, and he is an excellent journalist. Anyone on your following would probably disagree with him on a lot of things, I would still recommend that they follow him, because you're still going to be a very well-informed individual. He does often make silly arguments. Like, for instance, back in November, he produced an article and he was talking about the cabinet that Joe Biden was putting together. And it was one of the most impressive lists of corporate elites and Wall Street elites that I'd ever seen being tied to a single individual. And then he makes a very vague arguments about how a Biden administration is going to be hard on corporate America and Wall Street. And it made no sense, and his arguments were not very clear at all. However, he still puts together great articles on mergers and corporate America and Wall Street, even if his ideology is a bit skewed. And then you have Glenn Greenwald, and I use Glenn Greenwald a lot for my the security states stories. Of course, I always follow his sources to their core, and he isn't my only source that I go to. He's not my only source of information, of not primary but secondary information for these stories. I would recommend people get an online brokerage account. I'd recommend that they subscribe to the New York Times, that they subscribe to Glenn Greenwald on Substack, to Matt Stoller on Substack. And, like I said, Bloomberg, New York Times, you recently found a new one. What was it called again?
Bitter News.
Bitter News. Yeah. So I would recommend that people start going away from the clickbait model of news and actually reading articles from the primary source.